The extraordinary case of Elizabeth Woodcock, of Impington near Cambridge, who was buried in the snow of February 1799, 8 days and 8 nights, by William Granger. This is recorded to celebrate the 8th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Elizabeth Woodcock, aged 42 years, went on horseback from Impington to Cambridge on Saturday, being market day the 2nd of February, 1799. On her return home in the evening between 6 and 7 o'clock, being about half a mile from her own house, her horse started at a sudden light, which proceeded most probably from a meteor, a phenomenon which at this season of the year not unfrequently happens. She was herself struck with the light, and exclaimed, "Good God, what can this be?" It was a very inclement stormy night. A bleak wind blew boisterously from the northeast. The ground was covered by the great quantities of snow that had fallen during the day, yet it was not spread uniformly over the surface. The deepest ditches were many of them completely filled up, whilst in the open fields there was but a thin covering. But in the roads and lanes and many narrow and enclosed parts, it had accumulated to a considerable depth. Nowhere yet so as to render the ways impassable, but still enough to retard and impede the traveller. The horse, upon his starting, ran backward, and approached to the brink of a ditch, which the poor woman recollected, and fearing lest the animal in his fright should plunge into it, very prudently dismounted with all expedition. Her intention was to walk and lead the horse home, but he started again and broke from her. She repeated her attempt to take hold of the bridle, but the horse, still under the impression of fear, turned suddenly out of the road and directed his steps to the right over the common field. She followed him in hopes of quickly overtaking him, but unfortunately she lost one of her shoes in the snow. She was already wearied with the exertion that she had made, and besides had a heavy basket on her arm containing several articles of domestic consumption which she had brought from market. By these means her pursuit of the horse were greatly impeded. She, however, persisted, and followed him through the opening in a hedge, a little beyond which she overtook him, about a quarter of a mile from the place where she alighted, and, taking hold of the bridle, made another attempt to lead him home. But she had not retraced her steps farther than a thicket which lies contiguous to the said hedge, when she found herself so much fatigued and exhausted, her hands and feet, particularly her left foot, which was without a shoe, so very much benumbed that she was unable to proceed further. Sitting down upon the ground in this state, and letting go the bridle, "Tinker," she said, calling the horse by his name, "I am too much tired to go any farther. You must go home without me," and exclaimed, "Lord have mercy upon me, what will become of me?" The ground on which she sat was upon a level with the common field, close under the thicket on the southwest. She well knew the situation of it, and what was its distance from and bearing with respect to her own house. There was then but a small quantity of snow drifted near her, but it was beginning to accumulate, and it actually accumulates so rapidly that when Chesterton bell rang at 8 o'clock, she was completely enclosed and hemmed in by it. The depth of the snow in which she was enveloped was about 6 feet in a perpendicular direction, over her head between 2 and 3. Her imprisonment was now complete, for she was incapable of making any effectual attempt to extricate herself, and, in addition to her fatigue and cold, her clothes were stiffened by the frost. Resigning herself, therefore, calmly to the necessity of her bad situation, she sat awaiting the dawn of the following day. To the best of her recollection, she slept very little during the first night, or indeed any of the succeeding nights or days, except on Friday the 8th. Early the next morning she distinctly heard the ringing of a bell at one of the villages at a small distance. Her mind was now turned, as it was most natural, to the thoughts of her preservation, and busied itself in concerting expedients by means of which anyone who chanced to come near the place might discover her. On the morning of the 3rd, the first after her imprisonment, observing before her a circular hole in the snow, about 2 feet in length and half a foot in diameter, running obliquely upwards through the mass, she broke off a branch of the bush which was close to her, and with it thrust her handkerchief through the hole, and hung it, as a signal of distress, upon one of the uppermost twigs that remained uncovered, an expedient which will be seen in the sequel to have occasioned her discovery. She bethought herself at the same time that the change of the moon was near, and having an almanac in her pocket, she took it out, though with great difficulty, and consulting it, found that there would be a new moon the next day, February 4th. The difficulty which she found in getting the almanac out of her pocket arose in a great measure from the stiffness of her frozen clothes before mentioned. The trouble, however, was compensated by the consolation which the prospect of so near a change in her favour afforded. The extremity of this hole was closed up with a thin covering of snow or ice on the first morning, which easily transmitted the light. When she put out her handkerchief she broke it, in consequence of which, the external air being admitted, she felt herself very cold. On the second morning it was again closed up in a similar manner, and continued so till the 3rd day, after which time it remained open. She perfectly distinguished the alterations of day and night, heard the bells of her own and some of the neighbouring villages several different times, particularly that of Chesterton, which rings every night at 8 o'clock, and 4 in the morning during the winter half of the year, Sundays excepted, and is at the distance of nearly 2 miles from the place where she sat. She was sensible of the living scene around her, frequently noticing the sound of carriages upon the road, the natural cries of animals, such as the bleating of sheep and lambs, and the barking of dogs. One day she overheard a conversation carried on by 2 gypsies, relative to an ass which they had lost. She afterwards specified it was not their asses in general terms that they were talking about, but some particular one, and her precision in this respect has been confirmed by the acknowledgment of the gypsies themselves. She recollected having pulled out a snuff-box and taken 2 pinches of snuff, but, which is very strange, she felt so little gratification from it that she never repeated it. A common observer would have imagined the irritation arising from the snuff would have been peculiarly grateful to her, and that being deprived of all other comforts, she would have solaced herself with those which the box afforded, till the contents of it were exhausted. Possibly, however, the cold she endured might have so far blunted her powers of sensation that the snuff no longer retained its stimulus. At another time, finding her left hand beginning to swell in consequence of her reclining for a considerable time on that arm, she took 2 rings, the tokens of her nuptial vows twice pledged, from her finger, and put them, together with a little money which she had in her pocket, into a small box, sensibly judging that should she not be found alive, the rings and money being thus deposited were less likely to be overlooked by the discoverers of her breathless corpse. She frequently shouted out, in hopes that her vociferations reaching the ears of any that chanced to pass that way, they might be drawn to the spot where she was, but the snow so far prevented the transmission of her voice that no one heard her. The gypsies, who passed nearer to her than any other persons, were not sensible of any sound proceeding from her snow-formed cavern, though she particularly endeavoured to attract their attention. When the period of her seclusion approached to a termination, and a thaw took place on the Friday after the commencement of her misfortunes, she felt uncommonly faint and languid. Her clothes were wet quite through by the melted snow. The aperture before mentioned became considerably enlarged, and tempted her to make an effort to release herself, but alas, it was a vain attempt. Her strength was too much impaired, her feet and legs were no longer obedient to her will, and her clothes were becoming very much heavier by the water which they had imbibed. And now, for the first time, she began to despair of ever being discovered or taken out alive, and she declared that, all things considered, she could not have survived a continuation of her suffering for the space of 24 hours longer. It was now that the morning of her emancipation was arrived. Her sufferings increased. She sat with one of her hands spread over her face, and fetched the deepest sighs. Her breath was short and difficult, and symptoms of approaching dissolution became every hour more alarming. On Sunday, the 10th of February, a young farmer, whose name is Joseph Munsey, in his way home from Cambridge, about 12:30, crossed over the open field and passed very near the spot where the woman was. A coloured handkerchief hanging upon the tops of the twigs, where it was before said she had suspended it, caught his eye. He walked up to the place and espied an opening in the snow. It was the very aperture which led to the prisoner's apartment, and which was sufficiently large to afford the woman space enough to move herself about 3 or 4 inches in any direction, but not to stand upright, because only about 3.5 feet in height, and about 2 in the broadest part. He heard a sound issue from it, familiar to that of a person breathing hard and with difficulty. He looked in, and saw a female figure, whom he recognized at once to be the identical woman who had been so long missing. He did not speak to her, but seeing another young farmer and the shepherd at a little distance, he communicated to them the discovery he had made, upon which, though they scarcely gave any credit to his report, they went with him to the spot. The shepherd called out, "Are you there, Elizabeth Woodcock?" She replied in a faint and feeble accent, "Dear John Stittle, I know your voice. For God's sake, help me out of this place." Every effort was immediately made to comply with her request. Stittle made his way through the snow till he was able to reach her. She eagerly grasped his hand and implored him not to leave her. "I have been here a long time," she observed. "Yes," answered the man, "ever since Saturday." "Aye, Saturday week," she replied. "I have heard the bells go 2 Sundays for church," an observation which demonstrably proves how well apprised she was of the duration of her confinement. Mr. Munsey and Mr. Merrington, Jr., during this conversation, were gone to the village to inform the husband, and to procure proper means for conveying her home. They quickly returned, and in company with her husband, some of the neighbours, and the elder Mr. Merrington, who brought with him his horse and chaise cart, blankets to wrap her in, and some refreshment which he took it for granted she would stand in peculiar need of. The snow being a little more cleared away, Mr. M. went up to her, and upon her entreaty gave her a piece of biscuit and a small quantity of brandy, from both of which she found herself greatly recruited. As he took her up to put her into the chaise, the stocking of the left leg, adhering to the ground, came off. She fainted in his arms. Notwithstanding, he moved her with all the caution in his power. But nature was very much exhausted, and the motion, added to the impression which the sight of her husband and neighbours made upon her, was too much for her strength and spirits. The fit, however, was but of short continuance, and when she recovered, he laid her gently in the carriage, covered her well over with the blankets, and conveyed her, without delay or interruption, to her own house. When the horse came home, her husband and another person set out on the road with a lantern, and went quiet to Cambridge, where they only learnt that she left the inn at 6 that evening. They explored the road afresh that night, and for 4 succeeding days, and searched the huts of the gipsies, whom they suspected might have robbed and murdered her, in vain, till she was unexpectedly discovered in the manner already mentioned. Mr. Oakes, a surgeon, first saw her in the cart as she was removing home. She spoke to him with a voice tolerably strong, but rather hoarse. Her hands and arms were sodden, but not very cold, though her legs and feet were, and the latter in great measure mortified. She was immediately put to bed, and weak broth given her occasionally. From the time of her being lost, she had eaten only snow, and believed she had not slept till Friday the 8th. Her only evacuation was a little water. The hurry of spirits, occasioned by too many visitors, rendered her feverish, and her feet were found to be completely mortified from being frostbitten before she was covered with the snow. She was so disturbed with company that Mr. O. had little hope of her recovery. He ordered a clyster of mutton broth, which greatly relieved her, some saline mixture with antimonial wine, and strong decoction of bark, and 3 grains of opium in the course of a day. He opened the vesications on her feet, and continued the use of brandy as at first, clysters, opium, and bark being continued with port wine. The cold had extended its violent effects from the end of the toes to the middle of the instep, including more than an inch above the heels, and all the bottom of the feet, which were mortified, and were poulticed with stale beer and oatmeal boiled together. Inward cold, as she called it, affected her, and she desired the cataplasms might be renewed as often as possible, and very warm. The 19th and 20th she was seized with a violent diarrhea, which occasioned great weakness, and 2 days after, several toes were so loose as to be removed by the scissors. The 23rd she was taken up without fainting. All the toes were removed, and the integuments from the bottom of one foot, except a piece at the heel, which was so long ere it loosened itself that the oscalcis and tendo Achilles had suffered. The sloughs on the other foot were thrown off more slowly, and 2 of the toes removed. All but one great toe was removed by the 17th, and on removing the sloughs from the heels, the bone was bare in many places, and wherever the mortification had taken place was one large sore, very tender. The sores were much diminished, and the great toe was taken off by the end of March, and an unusual sleepiness came on. By April 17, the sores were free from sloughs and daily lessened. Her appetite tolerably good, and her general health began to amend. But with all these circumstances in her favour, she felt herself to be very uncomfortable, and in fact her prospect was most miserable. For though her life was saved, the mutilated state in which she was left, without even a chance of ever being able to attend to the duties of her family, was almost worse than death itself. For, from the exposure of the oscalcis, in all probability it would have required some months before the bottoms of her feet could be covered with new skin, and, after all, they would have been so tender as not to bear any pressure. The loss, too, of all her toes must have made it impossible for her to move herself but with the assistance of crutches. Mr. Oakes ascribes the preservation of her life to her not having slept or had any evacuations under the snow, and to her resignation and the calm state of her mind. She closed a lingering existence, July 13, 1799. We are sorry to add that too free indulgence of spirituous liquors is supposed to have been the cause both of the extraordinary accident and its fatal consequences. End of The Extraordinary Case of Elizabeth Woodcock of Impington near Cambridge, who was buried in the snow of February 1799, 8 days and 8 nights, by William Granger.